If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year, in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. David Diener. He is Assistant Professor of Education here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Diener, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Talking today about restoring science to the classical liberal arts tradition. How do many people today tend to think about what science is?
Well, people think about science differently, obviously, but I think a lot of people in our contemporary society think about science as something that's objective. It deals with fixed realities. It has a kind of authority. If you say, oh, scientists have, scientific researchers have shown that X, people go, oh, wow, that must be true. And interestingly, a lot of times also it's associated with technology. So a lot of times we use science or we study science in order to use it to do stuff or build stuff. And ironically, that understanding of science actually separates it from the way that we talk about classical liberal arts education in a way that I think is really problematic. And so what I would like to do is try to think about science as it's been understood historically, and that actually elevates it to a position of, I think, honor and great value within a paradigm of liberal arts education.
So you say it's problematic, that view. What's so problematic about that view of science?
Well, it treats science as distinct from, let's say, the humanities. So again, I'm generalizing here, but I think a lot of people think about science as having a kind of access to truth that's objective, whereas in the humanities, we study poetry or literature and develop opinions about things, but you can't really know. Whereas in chemistry and biology, we're dealing with the facts, and so you get this kind of fact value distinction, which is problematic. And it also means that science is not ultimately about the same kind of goal, doesn't have the same goals as those other disciplines. So I think within the tradition, you have that what we would call science is a part of a unified enterprise of pursuing knowledge and ultimately wisdom in order to help us to live well.
How is what we call science understood within this tradition of classical liberal arts education?
So historically, what we call science was thought of as natural philosophy. This is until very recently. So the word science actually, it comes from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. And so you get throughout the tradition people talking about the sciences as the branches of knowledge. So in the 13th century, for example, Kilwardby, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, identified up to 40 scientiae, 40 different disciplines of science. And so we think about, again, science as something very different from, let's say, what some people would think of as a humanities discipline or a squishier discipline, like literature or history or theology, something like that. Within the tradition, science is one kind of philosophy. And so it's completely normal to talk about the science of the divine, for example, what we would call theology. Aristotle talks about that. It's the highest of the sciences because it deals with the divine. And so traditionally, you had philosophy, which is literally or etymologically the pursuit of wisdom, broken up into three parts. So divine philosophy, moral philosophy, and natural philosophy. Divine philosophy studies the divine. It's what we might call theology today. And moral philosophy studies how to act, more things like ethics, politics, these kinds of questions, sort of these practical questions of how to live. And then natural philosophy studies the natural world. What kind of a place is the world? And then how do we fit into that place? And so again, you have what we would today call science within this much more holistic schema of philosophy. And the understanding was that all of these disciplines work together in order to give us a unified view of the cosmos, of God, of ourselves, of how we ought to live. And it ranges from the speculative to the practical.
What are some of those implications of thinking about science as natural philosophy?
Great question. Well, so let's think a little bit about where science starts or where philosophy starts and what it's directed toward. So again, throughout the whole tradition, there was this understanding that philosophy begins with a sense of wonder. Mm-hmm. It begins with a sense of awe or marveling at something and recognizing that we don't fully understand it. So Aquinas talks about this as the desiderium sciendi, the desire to know or a desire for knowledge, right? We see something and we think, that's interesting. I don't fully grasp that, and I would like to understand it. And that is the beginning of philosophy, including natural philosophy, or what today we would call science. And then ultimately, the goal of studying these things is wisdom. As I said, philosophy etymologically just means the love of wisdom. And so throughout the tradition, the study of the natural world also was understood as being directed toward a life of wisdom. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If you want to know how to live wisely, you have to know who you are, and you have to know what kind of a place the world is and how you interact with that world. That's part of what it means to live well. And so just as we might study theology to understand the nature of God, we might study ethics and politics to understand how we ought to live or how society works. We study the natural world in order to understand better what kind of a place we're living in. And that is a part of this holistic understanding of knowledge, or this unified enterprise of knowledge that then helps equip us in order to live well. And so in this sense, I think elevating this understanding elevates science because it helps science pursue something very noble, that is a life of wisdom, as opposed to merely being something that we use in order to build stuff or do stuff that doesn't really have any kind of moral or virtue component.
As you talk a little bit, I find it tough not to consider the past 5 years or so and the discussions of science in popular culture, in the news, and the loss of trust in science. You talked earlier about people having this idea about science as being objective, authoritative, with fixed realities. And many people over the past few years perhaps have looked at it and said, is it authoritative? Does it have fixed realities? Can we, in that word, trust the science when it comes to various things that have been happening? How does this idea about treating science in a classical liberal arts tradition, in natural philosophy, does it fit in any place with sort of the reimagining or rethinking of science that maybe many of us are having right now?
It's a great point, and you're right. I think we live in an age in which what many people think of as science has been pushed to a kind of extreme. Mm-hmm. And some people realize that the emperor doesn't have clothes. So C.S. Lewis has this really wonderful quote in The Abolition of Man, and he's talking in that context about values that have been that people develop that are not based on what he calls the Tao, or this universal set of principles. But he says that values not based on the Tao are fragments that have been wrenched from their context in the whole and then swollen to madness in their isolation. And I think about what many people think about science today in the 20th century in that way. It's been wrenched from its whole, from its context in this holistic understanding, and then swollen to madness. So you get the idea that science has this ability to give us real truth, or in its worst form, a scientism that says only empirical knowledge that comes from this understanding of science it counts as truth, okay, or counts as knowledge. And so what you've done is you've wrenched something that's actually very valuable in the pursuit of knowledge and in the pursuit of figuring out what it means to live well as an individual and as a society. You've wrenched that from its context within this broader holistic framework, and then you've swollen it to madness. Just follow the science, as though that will solve all of the problems. And as many people have pointed out, science is very valuable. What we call science today is very valuable. Mm-hmm. But most of the problems that we face as individual human beings and as a society, as a country, globally, most of the problems that we really care about cannot be reduced to these questions that the quote-unquote sciences can answer. And so we have to understand the natural world. That's really important. But we have to put that knowledge together with our understanding of the human psyche and of sociology and of how humans think and reason and of the nature of God and the nature of the human person, and understand all of these things together in order to be able to make wise decisions, again, both individually and as a society, that will actually address the key problems that we face. Science in this very narrow sense sometimes is like, to the person with a hammer, everything is a nail. Mm-hmm. And sometimes science in this very narrow sense attempts to address questions that it's simply not equipped to answer. And then, as you point out, that can make people sometimes cynical about it. And so, again, within this holistic framework, science is both limited but also elevated in that it's serving a much nobler purpose.
Talking with Dr. David Diener. He is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, as we discuss restoring science to the classical liberal arts tradition. So what is the purpose of science according to the liberal arts tradition?
So, again, within this context of pursuing wisdom, the ultimate goal, as with all of the sciences or all of the branches of knowledge, is to help us to understand ourselves and the world in order to better live within it. And I think that both allows us to have a humble approach to science, and also to recognize it as something very valuable or deeply human. It's not something that we do just because it allows us to have mastery over the world or to make the world conform to our desires. Rather, science understood in this way is part of our task as human beings of conforming ourselves with the givenness of the world in order to live wise and virtuous lives.
How does this understanding both limit in some ways and also elevate the role of science?
Well, it limits it in the sense that it recognizes that there are questions that science can't answer. So John Henry Newman in the 19th century writes a lot about the unity of knowledge. Especially, I'm thinking in The Idea of a University in that book. It's a wonderful book, one of the most important books in the philosophy of education, certainly from the 19th century, maybe in all of history. But he talks a lot about the unity of the disciplines of knowledge and how each of the disciplines plays a necessary part in this holistic understanding of the world. And he talks to a large extent about theology and what happens if you try to take that one out. But it's true of the other disciplines as well, and he recognizes this. If you take out one of the disciplines, one of the sciences, you have an incomplete perspective on the nature of the world. And so all of the sciences are working together. And so what happens when we either elevate one discipline out of proportion, like I said, like C.S. Lewis says, rip it out of its context and then swell it to madness. Or when we neglect it, when we don't think it's important, then what happens is we get a twisted view of reality. And so again, I think if you say the goal of learning, the goal of education is to help students to live wise and virtuous lives, again, both individually and as a society corporately, then when you put what we call science within that context, it has a noble role to play, but it's also a limited role. Mm-hmm. So it can't answer all of the questions, but it also does have something to say about what we may think sometimes as more values-based or relativistic or humanities style questions. All of the disciplines work together in this coherent whole.
Talk more about that, the idea of science and natural philosophy working in tandem with other parts of this classical liberal arts tradition.
So if we think about what we call science, these branches of natural philosophy, as part of this unified whole, what we see is that they speak to each other. So for example, we might say something like medicine or pharmacology. We understand the chemistry and the physiology of the human body in order to develop medicines or treatments. And you might say, for what end? Mm-hmm. Well, if the entire purpose is because, or if somebody says, well, we do it because we can, right? Then that's separated or disjointed from a broader understanding of human flourishing. But if we have a holistic view of the sciences as part of this broader framework, then we say, look, these are disciplines that help us gain knowledge about the way that the human body works, or the way that plants work, or the way that crops, for food production work, these kinds of questions. But these are serving a broader purpose of human flourishing, for example. And so the question isn't just, can we do this, but should we do this? And that ennobles those disciplines that are helping human beings to improve their quality of life, or if we're helping to provide food for people. But it goes the other way as well. So if you think about the ethics or the political questions, the ethical questions, these other kinds of questions, those too have something to say to science. So again, the question isn't merely, can we do this, but should we do this? Mm-hmm. What are the collateral effects of this scientific quote unquote advance, right? How does this advance that we've made affect society or affect human beings and their ability to live well? And so again, if you have that kind of cross-pollination of the disciplines speaking to each other, you have what we would call science helping to answer these deeply human questions, and then also the other disciplines putting some parameters around or giving a broader framework within which science has value and meaning, and also appropriate limits.
What kind of work needs to be done? What recommendations do you have to get to a place where science has been restored, when the restoration is complete, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, within the context of classical education and this liberal arts approach to education, I think that we need, so within the context of schools or educational institutions, I think we need to think of or reimagine the sciences as part of this broader enterprise. I think within classical schools and liberal arts colleges, it's easy to talk about the way that what we call the humanities help us to live fully human lives, right? We study literature and history in order to understand human nature and study the heroes and villains of the past in order to model our lives after them. And then sometimes we get to science or math as well, and we say, well, yeah, and we have to study that stuff too, but we don't have a really compelling vision for why those disciplines are important, why studying biology and chemistry and physics and physiology and all the rest actually have a really important role to play in helping students to live a fully human life. And so I think having conversations like this and reimagining that is really, really valuable. And then at a broader level, I would just say, I think, sometimes if you're on the wrong path, as has been said, if you're on the wrong path, the best way forward is to go back. Uh-huh. And so I think our view of science today is enervated in many ways. And I would argue that we ought to go back to this more historically grounded understanding of science as natural philosophy. And I think by doing that, it actually provides a really wonderful and productive and useful and compelling path forward as we think about the way that the scientific disciplines can contribute to society and contribute to these broader questions that we care about.
Dr. David Diener is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, talking today about restoring science to the classical liberal arts tradition. Dr. Diener, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. That's Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.